My wealthy neighbor's martial arts champion son tossed his MMA gloves at my feet and dared me to fight in front of the entire block. Everyone stopped talking. Phones came out. Children were pulled closer by their parents. They were waiting for an old man to be humiliated. "Pick them up," he said with a grin, "or admit you're a coward." His father leaned against a polished black SUV, smiling with the quiet confidence of a man who believed money could buy respect as easily as it bought silence. They had spent months treating every neighbor like they owned the street, but today they wanted something bigger. They wanted a public victory over the one person who never bowed to them. I looked down at the gloves lying on the pavement. The worn leather stirred memories I had locked away years earlier. My pulse never changed. My hands never shook. They saw a quiet retiree standing alone. They had no clue I had once led an elite Army Ranger unit, where pride got people hurt, but patience won. Battles long before the first punch was ever thrown. I've learned that the loudest people usually mistake silence for weakness. After leaving the Army, I never felt the need to correct them. My career had taught me that the strongest advantage was often letting people believe exactly what they wanted. I settled into a quiet neighborhood where most people knew me only as Daniel, the gray-haired widower who kept his lawn trimmed, repaired old furniture in his garage, and waved politely without joining neighborhood gossip. That reputation suited me. I had spent enough years carrying responsibility that retirement felt like the first real peace I'd ever earned. My late wife used to laugh whenever someone underestimated me. "One day," she would say, "someone's going to mistake your kindness for surrender." I always smiled because she was usually right. She understood that discipline wasn't about proving strength. It was about deciding when strength actually needed to be shown. After she passed away, I promised myself I would never let anger become my companion. Every morning I followed the same routine: coffee before sunrise, a slow walk through the neighborhood, then hours restoring old wooden furniture in my workshop. Building something useful from damaged pieces reminded me that quiet patience often accomplished more than force ever could. Then the Hawthorne family moved in across the street. Money surrounded everything they did. Luxury cars appeared almost overnight. Contractors transformed their house into the biggest on the block. Expensive parties became weekly events, and every conversation somehow circled back to success, status, or influence. Their son, Tyler, was a celebrated MMA champion with local trophies, sponsorships, and thousands of followers online. He trained outside where everyone could watch, almost as if every workout needed an audience. People admired his confidence, but I noticed something else beneath it: a young man who had rarely been told no. Whenever our paths crossed, Tyler greeted me with the same amused smile people reserve for someone they believe no longer matters. I never answered with anything more than a polite nod. In his mind, I was just an aging neighbor with aching knees and quiet habits. He never realized that the calm old man he dismissed had spent a lifetime studying people before confronting them, and that habit would soon become far more important than any punch he could throw. The challenge with the gloves wasn't the beginning. It was simply the moment everyone finally noticed what had been happening for months. Tyler had turned small acts of disrespect into a routine. Whenever I walked past his driveway during my morning stroll, he would slam heavy training pads together just as I came by. The sharp crack echoed through the quiet street, followed by a smirk meant only for me. I never looked back. His father wasn't any different. During neighborhood gatherings, he'd speak over me before I finished a sentence, then apologize with a smile that never reached his eyes. "You probably don't keep up with these things," he'd say, whenever the conversation shifted to business or investments. The others laughed politely, unsure whether they had just witnessed a joke or an insult. I noticed the uncomfortable glances between my neighbors. Most of them disliked the behavior, but no one wanted trouble with the wealthiest family on the block. Silence became easier than honesty. A week later, I found fresh tire marks cutting across the edge of my carefully maintained lawn. My mailbox had been knocked crooked. Security cameras from nearby homes somehow missed the moment. Tyler simply shrugged when I quietly straightened the post. "Guess things wear out with age," he said as he walked away. I answered with the same calm nod. That seemed to frustrate him more than any argument could have. Soon his social media videos featured friendly neighborhood jokes. Without mentioning my name, he'd point his camera toward my house while talking about people who were too old to stand up for themselves. His followers laughed in the comments. The clips spread far beyond our street. Neighbors began watching every interaction between us with quiet curiosity, sensing that something inevitable was approaching. They expected one of us to lose control, but I had spent too many years learning that real battles are rarely won by the first person who reacts. So I kept repairing my fence, watering my flowers, and greeting everyone with the same steady voice. The louder Tyler became, the more carefully I listened, because every careless word, every small insult, and every public performance was quietly building the evidence he never realized he was handing me. The morning everything changed started like any other. I was trimming the hedge along my front yard when Tyler rolled up with a small crowd of friends. They were filming another social media video, laughing before the camera was even recording. His father stood nearby with a cup of coffee, watching with quiet amusement. Tyler walked onto my lawn without asking. He spun an MMA glove on one finger, then tossed both gloves onto the grass at my feet. "Come on, old man," he said, loud enough for the entire street to hear. "You've been acting tough with that silent attitude for months. Fight me. Let's show everyone what you're made of." Doors opened. Curtains shifted. Neighbors stepped onto their porches, drawn by the noise. For a few seconds, no one spoke. I looked at the gloves, then at the phones pointed in my direction. It became clear that this wasn't about proving who was stronger. Tyler wanted a viral video. His father wanted the neighborhood to see me embarrassed. They believed public humiliation would finally force me to react. That was the moment I realized silence alone was no longer enough. Not because my pride was hurt, but because allowing this behavior to continue would teach everyone watching, especially the younger kids on our block, that intimidation deserved applause. I slowly picked up the gloves. A ripple of excitement spread through the crowd. Tyler's smile widened, convinced he'd already won. Then I calmly handed the gloves back to him. "In my life," I said quietly, "I've learned that a fight only proves something when both people have something worth proving." The grin on his face faded for the first time. I turned toward the neighbors instead of Tyler. "If this is going to continue," I said, "let's make sure everyone sees the whole story, not just the part that looks good on a phone screen." That single sentence changed the atmosphere. For the first time, Tyler wasn't controlling the moment anymore. Neither he nor his father realized that the real contest had just begun, and it wouldn't be decided with fists. I went inside without another word, leaving Tyler standing in the middle of the street with his gloves still in his hands. Some people thought I had backed down. I let them believe it. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with a notebook instead of anger. Years in the Army had taught me that every successful mission began with information, not emotion. Charging forward without a plan was how people made mistakes they couldn't undo. Over the next several days, I changed nothing about my routine. I still walked the neighborhood before sunrise, worked in my garage, and greeted everyone politely. The difference was that I started paying closer attention. My home's security cameras had quietly recorded every encounter near my property for months. I reviewed the footage one evening at a time, organizing each clip by date. There were videos of Tyler stepping onto my lawn without permission, throwing objects into my yard, mocking me while his friends filmed, and his father encouraging the behavior with amused smiles instead of stopping it. Several neighbors, relieved that someone was finally taking the situation seriously, privately offered copies of recordings from their doorbell cameras. Others agreed to write brief statements describing what they had repeatedly seen. I never pressured anyone. I simply thanked them and accepted their help. By the end of the week, I had assembled a clear, chronological record that spoke louder than any emotional argument ever could. I wasn't preparing to embarrass Tyler. I was preparing to hold him accountable. In the Rangers, we had a simple rule: never strike first when patience can accomplish the mission. This wasn't about revenge through violence. It was about allowing the truth, carefully collected, impossible to deny, and presented at exactly the right moment to become the strongest move on the board. 3 days later, the Homeowners Association held its monthly meeting. Attendance was higher than usual. Word of Tyler's public challenge had spread through the neighborhood, and many people expected another confrontation. I arrived a few minutes early, carrying a small folder instead of the anger everyone assumed I had been hiding. Tyler and his father walked in together, confident and relaxed. Tyler gave me the same familiar smirk before taking a seat near the front. He was certain the story would end the way all his online videos did, with him looking untouchable. When the meeting opened for community concerns, I stood. "I won't take much of your time," I said calmly. "I'd simply like everyone to see the full picture." The room fell silent. Without raising my voice, I handed copies of a timeline to the board members, and the security footage began playing on the screen. Clip after clip showed the same pattern. Tyler stepping onto my property, damaging my lawn, throwing the gloves at my feet, mocking me for an audience, and his father watching with quiet approval. No dramatic narration was needed. The videos spoke for themselves. The smiles slowly disappeared from their faces. Then came the recordings from neighboring doorbell cameras, followed by written statements from residents who had witnessed months of intimidation. Piece by piece, the image Tyler had carefully built online began to crumble under the weight of undeniable facts. No one applauded. No one needed to. The silence in the room carried more weight than any argument. The association voted to issue formal penalties for repeated property violations and disruptive behavior. Tyler was instructed to stay off my property, and any future incidents would be referred directly to local authorities. As people quietly filed out, several neighbors stopped to shake my hand. Tyler never looked at me. His father couldn't find a single word to defend what everyone had just seen. I left the meeting exactly as I had entered it, calm, composed, and without celebrating. Because the greatest victories aren't earned by defeating someone in front of a crowd. They're earned when the truth quietly walks into the room and no one can argue with it. The neighborhood felt different after that meeting. For the first time in months, the street was quiet, not because people were afraid to speak, but because the tension that had settled over every conversation had finally disappeared. Neighbors who had once hurried past my house now stopped to chat for a few minutes. Some admitted they had wanted to stand up earlier but had convinced themselves it wasn't their place. "I guess we were waiting for someone else to do it," one elderly neighbor said. I understood. Fear rarely announces itself. Sometimes it simply disguises itself as convenience. Tyler disappeared from the neighborhood for several weeks. When he eventually returned, the loud music was gone. The cameras stayed inside, and his morning training sessions became private. He no longer searched for an audience every time he stepped outdoors. His father changed too. One afternoon, he walked across the street alone. There was no expensive SUV parked behind him, no crowd, no confidence borrowed from spectators. He stood at the edge of my driveway for a moment before quietly apologizing for allowing pride to guide his family. I accepted his apology without making him earn it twice. Holding on to bitterness would only have given the past more power than it deserved. Something else changed that day. The younger families on the block began encouraging their children to greet every neighbor with respect, regardless of age or appearance. More people looked out for one another instead of pretending not to notice when someone was being treated unfairly. It wasn't a dramatic transformation, but it was real. And real change rarely arrives with applause. Looking back, I realized this story had never been about an aging veteran or a young fighter. It was about a choice every person eventually faces. When someone mistakes kindness for weakness, do you answer with anger or with character? Anger might win a moment. Character can change an entire community. And that's why this matters. Because sooner or later, every one of us will stand in front of our own crowd, facing someone who believes silence means surrender. In that moment, remember this: the strongest person in the room isn't always the one ready to throw the first punch. It's the one patient enough to let the truth finish the fight. Several months have passed since that afternoon, and the neighborhood has settled into the kind of quiet I used to think was impossible. The hedge has grown back. The marks on my lawn have disappeared. Every morning, I still carry a cup of coffee onto my porch before sunrise, listening to birds replace the noise that once echoed across the street. It reminds me that peace isn't something you find, it's something you protect. Tyler and I occasionally cross paths. We exchange brief nods. Nothing more. There is no friendship between us. But there is something more valuable: mutual respect. Whether he learned it from the consequences or from watching them unfold, I can't say. Either way, the lesson finally reached him. Sometimes I think about my years leading Army Rangers. People often imagine those years were defined by combat, but the greatest lesson I carried home had nothing to do with fighting. It was learning that strength isn't measured by how quickly you can overpower another person. It's measured by how completely you can control yourself when every emotion tells you not to. My late wife used to tell me that every person leaves behind a reputation long before they leave behind a memory. Standing on my porch now, I finally understand what she meant. No one remembers who could throw the hardest punch. They remember who acted with integrity when everyone else expected anger. The neighbors often wave as they pass. Children ride their bicycles safely down the street again, and the block feels less like a collection of houses and more like a community. That quiet change means more to me than winning any public confrontation ever could. Looking back, I realize I never defeated Tyler. I defeated the fear that intimidation should go unanswered. And I did it without becoming the kind of man I refused to be. The gloves he threw at my feet are long gone. But the choice I made that day remains. Because in the end, the strongest victory isn't the one that leaves your opponent on the ground. It's the one that lets you walk away with your character still standing.